I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. For the first time in a year, we are hopeful the end of the pandemic is in sight. But are we prepared for the next one? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Infections that don't respond to antimicrobial treatment are already becoming more common. What will doctors do when the antibiotics and antifungal drugs they've relied upon for decades stop working?
Hospitals are among the most secretive organizations in the country. Trying to figure out the true cost of treatment is extremely challenging.
Prescription drugs have become budget busters. What can we do to reverse this trend?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, could antimicrobial resistant infections become the next pandemic?
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, public health experts have been worried about the evolution of SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus responsible for COVID-19. Some of the new variants that have arisen may have the potential to be transmitted more easily. That appears to be the case with B.1.1.7, a variant first identified in the UK. Researchers in Great Britain looked at genomes from over 1,000 COVID-positive nasal swabs and found that most people had only one or two variants, but a few had numerous mutated viral genomes. Mutations in the spike protein have scientists concerned because they could help the virus evade the immune system. The variant called P1, first detected in Brazil, is worrisome in this regard. A report published in the New England Journal of Medicine has allayed some fears. According to the manufacturers, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine is effective against P1 in laboratory tests. The researchers used serum from vaccinated volunteers and found that it neutralized the virus.
A small study published last November in JAMA disappeared almost without a trace. It compared fluvoxamine to placebo for treating COVID patients. The results were surprisingly good. Out of 152 people with COVID-19, 80 took fluvoxamine and 72 took a look-alike placebo pill. 6 of those on placebo had serious clinical deterioration, compared to none of those on fluvoxamine. This study is being replicated in a larger trial to confirm whether fluvoxamine has significant benefits against COVID. This generic medicine is prescribed primarily to treat obsessive-compulsive disorder. It's been around since 1994, so doctors know what sorts of side effects to expect. It has the ability to modulate the immune response, which may explain how it might prevent mild COVID-19 infections from becoming more serious.
During the clinical trials of both the Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines, there were a few reports of severe allergic reactions. The CDC has reported that the incidence of these anaphylactic reactions ranges from 2.5 to 11 cases per million vaccinations. A new study published in JAMA tracked anaphylactic reactions among nearly 65,000 vaccinated healthcare workers at Mass General Brigham Hospital. 16 of these employees reported anaphylactic reactions. 5 of them had previously experienced serious allergic reactions. Although this incidence of anaphylaxis was higher than that detected in the clinical vaccine trials, it remains very low.
Cardiovascular disease remains the number one killer throughout the world. People at high risk are often prescribed a number of medications to control cholesterol, lower blood pressure, and prevent blood clots. A new study in JAMA suggests those who have had heart attacks or strokes might also benefit from 2 servings of fish a week. The investigators analyzed data from 4 large epidemiological studies that included almost 200,000 individuals from 58 countries. The median duration of follow-up was 7.5 years. People who had significant cardiovascular conditions when the study started got the most benefit. If they ate 2 weekly servings of oily fish such as salmon, tuna, sardines, herring, or mackerel, they were less likely to suffer heart attacks or strokes or to die during the study. An accompanying editorial concludes, quote, modest fish consumption appears to have some cardiac benefits, even for healthy people.
Pig farming is big business in eastern North Carolina. These large farms have become breeding grounds for drug-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. A study published in the journal Emerging Infectious Diseases reports that Staph aureus is spreading from pigs to people. DNA sequencing has identified similar strains of the bacteria that have moved from the animals to farmers and from farmers' families to residents in the communities. Most of the identified isolates were resistant to several different antibiotics. The researchers did not collect information on whether they were responsible for infections in these neighboring communities. They suggest, however, that these data are urgently needed. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
For the last year, everyone has been completely focused on the virus that causes COVID-19. That's entirely understandable because nearly 120 million people have caught SARS-CoV-2. More than 2.6 million people have died.
Everyone is hoping that vaccination will help overcome the pandemic in coming months. But are we prepared for the next pandemic? Our guest says it's already started and we're not paying enough attention.
Dr. Marty Makary is a professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He's editor-in-chief of MedPage Today. His current research focuses on the underlying causes of disease, vulnerable populations, and relationship-based medicine. His latest book is The Price We Pay: What Broke American Healthcare and How to Fix It.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Marty Makary.
Great to be with you guys again.
Well, thank you for joining us, Dr. Makary. It seems as if we are all overwhelmed by this pandemic. It's almost a year, maybe a little more than a year, that we've been dealing with this almost on a daily basis. And yet we've been dealing with pandemics for a very long time. And you've talked about the second pandemic that has already started. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Sure. Well, I know it's hard to talk about the idea of another pandemic after we've all just made tremendous sacrifices and seen a terrible loss of life. But there is another pandemic that will be worse on its current trajectory than COVID-19. And it has already started. And we're already seeing deaths from it in the hospital, thousands of deaths. I've seen deaths. And that is the pandemic of bacteria that are resistant to everything we have out there. It is a slow-moving pandemic. It's not sweeping through New York in 3 weeks like COVID did. It is slowly moving in year by year, and it is expected to account for 10 million deaths by 2050, just 30 years from now, 10 million deaths in 1 year alone. So it is a serious problem we've got to start paying attention to. Now, unlike the other COVID pandemic, there's a lot we can do to really crush it early.
Oh, do tell us about some of what we can do to crush it.
Well, first of all, what is it?
So it is the problem of what we call AMR, antimicrobial resistance. So bacteria are routinely destroyed with antibiotic medicines that we prescribe as physicians. And we've taken it for granted. You know, women used to die. The number one cause of death was childbirth from infections that would take over their body after the childbirth.
Hence Dr. Semmelweis.
That's right. Kids would die. People would lose 2 or 3 kids in a large family from different causes, some trauma, but some from from bacteria, from these what we call superbugs, but really they're not necessarily superbugs. Sometimes they're just regular bacteria that can take over your body and cause sepsis. So, for example, a kid gets an ear infection. We take it for granted that it usually goes away. The body's immunity usually fights it. We tend to throw antibiotics at it. And if it gets bad, then we definitely get antibiotics in that kid's system. And life moves on, right? We don't see kids dying from ear infections. Well, that's because the antibiotics work. Well, what's happening is we're overusing antibiotics so much that the bugs are getting smart and now they're resistant. And the problem of these resistant bugs is so big that actually now they're spreading and nothing we have works. And the bigger concern is that the drugs that are being developed cannot keep up with the pace of the mutations that create the resistance. In other words, we can't manufacture drugs fast enough to keep up with the exponential growth of mutations and resistance to those antibiotics. And that is a problem that we can fix. We can stop overusing antibiotics. We can choose healthier foods. We can do a lot right now to address it before it becomes really bad.
Dr. McCary, you're a surgeon, if I understand correctly. You're not an infectious disease expert. So what got you so excited about the idea of antimicrobial resistance?
We take out organs sometimes as surgeons because we have no more antibiotics that work. In other words, the person is sick because a bacteria has infected an organ, like the colon, and none of the antibiotics that we use to treat that infection now work like they did, say, 10 or 20 years ago. So we've taken it for granted that we can often treat things. And now these weapons against these infections are not working. And so we actually have situations now where somebody comes in with a colon infection called C. diff, Clostridium difficile. And because the antibiotics, all the different antibiotics that often work, none of them work. And so we watch a patient go down this terrible trajectory where they get worse and worse. They get sicker and sicker. We move them to the ICU. All we're doing is really supporting them. We're giving them oxygen and, we're giving them fluids so they don't dehydrate, but we're watching this infection take hold and make somebody deathly sick. And finally, this last resort option that we have, it's a primitive option, but we go in surgically through a big incision and we remove that infected organ as a way to address the infection. I mean, you do that enough times, as most of us in general surgery have done, it leaves an impression on you. And as you know, I spend 80 to 90% of my time in public health and public health research, working on public policy and issues of transparency in healthcare, trying to push the field. And you can't help but say, hey, this is a problem that we can prevent. We've got to start addressing it. This is a problem we're not talking about that we need to talk about.
Dr. McCary, you've mentioned C. diff, and I think a lot of our listeners have heard about this bacteria, C. difficile. Used to be called Clostridium difficile. I think it has a new name. But what else are you concerned about? What other kinds of microbial resistance? I mean, there are other bacteria out there. There's methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. There's vancomycin-resistant Enterococcus. There's something called MDR-TB, multi-drug-resistant Mycobacterium TB. CRE, carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae. I never could pronounce that. And then, of course, there are fungi. Give us a sense of how big the problem is and what you're worried about.
Yeah, so let's just talk about sort of the carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae. Now, you mentioned that one. That is a bacteria that kills about 1,000 people a year. Okay, this is an infection. People are living their normal life. They feel great. And guess what? They get this infection and they die from it. Now, we have had drugs that we have called, quote unquote, and you'll hear this, the drug of last resort, right? We've heard this term a lot in pharmacy, and that is this is the big gun antibiotic, and we don't like to use it as the first line agent. But if things get bad, we use this. And so carbapenem was that antibiotic that was known as the drug of last resort for this Enterobacter. And guess what? It doesn't work anymore for some of those cases. We saw, one of the concerns that many of us have in public health is that the time for a bug to become resistant is shortening. Okay, increasingly, it's taking a year, whereas it used to take 21 years. So if you look from 1945 to 1970, it took bugs on average 21 years to mutate around resistance, to mutate around gentamicin, one of the drugs that bacteria mutated around between 1945 and 1970. Then in the next 15 years, not 25 years, we've seen that mutation take about 13 years, mutating around ciprofloxacin. And in between 1995 and today, it's taken on average 1 year for bugs to mutate around drugs like levofloxacin. So we're seeing exponential rates of mutation. And as we've learned from COVID, the thing about exponential change is that things are fine until suddenly they're not. And you can't, go back and say, okay, now we're going to implement things that take several months or longer to have an effect in the midst of exponential growth. And right now we are in the midst of that uptake, that incline towards exponential growth. And that's why I think this is a warning call to everybody.
Dr. McCary, why hasn't this problem of antimicrobial resistance received more attention?
Well, it's a small market size for the pharmaceutical companies. When you talk about the government pre-purchasing a COVID vaccine, heck, they all jump. They're giddy. They're rushing to the table. They want in. There were about 5 companies in the original Operation Warp Speed, and Novavax pounded on the door, and they let them in, and they pre-purchased, lots of drugs from these companies. And, it's good. It's not a knock, but where's the enthusiasm around drugs that have a small market size? Okay, when you talk about 1,000 deaths from carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteria, that is a small market, right? We're not talking about immunizing 150 million people. We're talking about 1,000 deaths a year. And unfortunately, and tragically, these small market sizes have left these, money-focused pharma companies disinterested in addressing the problem for now. And by the time they develop interest, when it becomes, a bigger blown-up pandemic, I'm afraid that's going to be too late.
You're listening to Dr. Marty McCary, professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He's been elected to the National Academy of Medicine and is editor-in-chief of MedPage Today. His most recent book is The Price We Pay: What Broke American Healthcare and How to Fix It.
After the break, we'll talk about the most effective steps we can take now to fight the pandemic of antibiotic resistance.
What you put on your plate could have an impact on the future effectiveness of antibiotics. How should you change your shopping habits?
What lessons can we take from COVID-19 to apply to this other looming pandemic?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy podcast is supported in part by CocoVia Memory Plus. CocoVia cocoflavanols support both cardiovascular health and cognitive function by promoting healthy blood flow, transporting oxygen and nutrients to vital organs and muscles, including your heart and brain.
CocoVia Memory Plus has 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols, the plant-based nutrients from fresh cocoa that have been proven to help boost memory.
CocoVia Memory Plus is backed by 4 clinical trials that demonstrate improvement in 3 different aspects of memory: long-term memory, spatial memory, and word recall. The studies show improved brain function in just 8 weeks.
You can try the benefits of CocoVia Memory Plus with a 25% discount off your first month. Use the code People's 25. To get the full benefits, take it daily for 8 weeks. Cocovia is offering People's Pharmacy podcast listeners a 10% discount on subscriptions. That code is People's10. Learn more at cocovia.com.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Cocovia Memory Plus, a cocoflavanol supplement backed by 4 clinical studies that show significant improvement in 3 different aspects of memory. More information at cocovia.com.
We are talking today about the problem of antibiotic resistance. Is another pandemic on the horizon? Are we prepared for infections we cannot treat with current medications?
Is there anything individuals can do to address this global challenge?
Our guest is Dr. Marty Makary. He practices surgical oncology at Johns Hopkins Hospital and is a professor of health policy and management at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. His most recent book, The Price We Pay, received the 2020 Business Book of the Year award. Dr. Makary is a fellow of the National Academy of Medicine and editor-in-chief of MedPage Today.
Dr. Makary, I wonder, you mentioned that healthcare professionals and the rest of us could take steps now to actually address this slow motion but very frightening second pandemic. What steps would be most effective?
Well, first of all, there is massive overuse of antibiotics that drives this mutation and drives the resistance. And we should just stop using antibiotics when they're not indicated. That simple step alone would have a massive benefit in public health. And by the way, it's not just in humans. It's in animals. It's in the food we eat. A lot of the antibiotics produced are used in agriculture. If you look at all the drugs manufactured that are antibiotics, up to 70 to 80% of them have gone to animals. So if we talk about our purchasing decisions, if we talk about preventing this pandemic through our choices at the grocery store and asking questions at restaurants that push them to use better sourcing of their food, we can actually move markets just like we have with reducing added sugar and getting away from other bad foods. So these are important steps I encourage everyone to do. We're doing it on a macro level, a group called PIRG, which it's a tremendous group. They're putting pressure on some of these chain restaurants to shift, and it's working. They've gotten some of these big places to actually change where they source their food. It's remarkable, actually, what they've been able to do. When people speak up, things happen. Did you know that, for example, Panera and Chipotle have actually made commitments now to avoid antibiotics in their foods? These are chain restaurants with large customer bases that a decision at their level, at the corporate level, has tremendous implications. There's strides made at McDonald's, a place that we've been hammering in public health for their processed food. They're taking steps now to get rid of all antibiotics in their food. Now, they're small steps, but we're seeing movement, and it's driven by people and their choices.
Dr. Makary, this gives me so much hope because I think a lot of times people feel overwhelmed. It's like, what can I do? Well, my little voice, how can I have an impact? And what you're suggesting is we can have an impact.
Every time you go to a restaurant, ask whether or not the fish are from fish farms, because antibiotic use is common in fish farming. 90% of salmon comes from fish farming. And if we start asking, guess what? They're going to start wanting it, choosing different sourcing. Same in the grocery stores. We can ask questions and move markets. And I think that's the exciting thing. Now, doctors have a role here too, by the way. Pharmacists, clinicians, nurse practitioners, PAs, all of us that interact with everyday patients, consumers of healthcare, anyone out there, we have a platform, The medical profession is still a respected voice out there. And we at every level, at every single clinical level, need to be sending the message that an important public health strategy, just like we should avoid smoking, is choosing antibiotic-free food. And if we did that with a collective voice, harmonious, just as we did to tell people about the public health risks of smoking, we could educate a generation. And that's what I do with every patient I see.
Dr. McCary, I'd like to ask you about healthcare, and in particular, what we've learned from COVID-19. I mean, initially, there was a tremendous resistance to the idea of masks and social distancing. And subsequently, we've learned that it can make a difference. But what about antibacterial resistance in hospitals and in healthcare? And I'm thinking about one of your colleagues from a very long time ago, and that's Dr. Semmelweis, and how he was dismissed by his colleagues about hand washing.
Yeah, so hand washing is important. I think we have seen during COVID the overuse of antibiotics. For example, early in the pandemic, azithromycin was just thrown at people. That's an antibiotic given to people with COVID. And you'd ask doctors, why are you giving an antibiotic? Well, there could be a co-infection. Or if there's a small chance there's a co-infection, we want to treat it with the antibiotic. Okay, well, these poor judgments, giving an antibiotic when it's not indicated is resulting in a lot of the resistance. There was a study that looked at 2,000 hospitalized patients. Okay, this was a study that came out in one of the journals, Journal of Clinical Infectious Diseases. 2,000 people, 76 got an antibiotic. Only 8% had a bacteria. Okay, so I mean, this is the kind of overuse. And by the way, overuse is a problem much broader and has much more implications for our healthcare system, for healthcare costs, for the resilience of our healthcare system, and for the public trust that is important in healthcare. We've got to stop the medicalization of ordinary life. We've got to stop throwing drugs at people where the treatment is not a pharmaceutical treatment. We've got to start asking the questions we haven't been asking. We've got to look at the whole person. And Terry and Joe, I love it that you talk about this on your show. We as doctors need to be talking about treating diabetes with cooking classes instead of just throwing insulin at early stage diabetes. People come in with back pain. We've got to talk more about ice and physical therapy than just a lumbar laminectomy with hardware insertion. People come in with hypertension. Let's talk about sleep, because bad sleep contributes to high vasoactive tone, instead of just throwing meds at people. People come in with inflammatory conditions like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis and irritable bowel. Instead of just throwing meds, can we talk about food as medicine and the inflammatory state and lifestyle changes? Can we address one of the big epidemics that nobody's been talking about, that we need to talk about, loneliness, which has been rampant among seniors and magnified during COVID and affects a body's physiologic reserves? Can we talk about rebuilding communities instead of throwing antidepressants? So we've got to address these underlying problems that we have not been talking about in this rote memorization culture of medical school of memorize and regurgitate, memorize and regurgitate.
Dr. McCary, you definitely have a couple people here who are totally on board with this message, but I am imagining not all of your colleagues would actually be totally on board, and here's why. And we're going to talk about this more. They say, we don't have the time, we don't have the resources. It's not expensive for us to prescribe an antidepressant and to actually do something about the person's life circumstances that are causing depression. That's difficult. That's expensive. We don't have the resources. How do you respond?
Well, first of all, I get it. Look, physician burnout is very high. Corporate medicine is now dominating the practice of some physicians. We don't like it. Okay, we as doctors don't like it. This is not what we signed up for. We're not happy sometimes with these rapid 15-minute cookie cutter quotas that we have. And so you're seeing a revolution right now in medicine that is so exciting. I just absolutely love it. And I was privileged to profile it in the book, The Price We Pay. It is the relationship-based medicine doctors, driven in part by a young generation that are saying, we don't want to be a part of corporate medicine. We don't want to be just pushing drugs. We want to talk about the underlying drivers of illness. We want to get to these root causes. And there are clinics like ChenMed and Iora and direct primary care and these new programs now where relationships are the basis of the clinic. And so you're seeing clinics now bust free from that fee-for-service model, that broken fee-for-service model. And they're saying, look, Medicare Advantage, you pay us sort of an annual lump sum. We call it globally capitated payment. And we will take care of this population with a deep passion, and you will see the results. You will see the results in this population. And it's exciting. I mean, this is the future. If you know anything about sort of millennials, they are a social justice minded group, right? They want to be a part of something larger than themselves. Social justice is a generational value. And that's why we've seen them partner with us on addressing surprise billing and other predatory billing practices. It's exciting to see a group of doctors now emerge, nurses, all clinicians, the same, saying, look, we don't want to be a part of this system that, we're inheriting. We want to start from scratch. And it's pretty cool.
Dr. McCary, we love your book, The Price We Pay: What Broke American Healthcare and How to Fix It. And you just talked about surprise billing, which brings me back to COVID. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people have been hospitalized. Many of them have spent not just hours, not just days, but weeks in the ICU, the intensive care units. I am just scared to death about the cost. These people are going to go home and then they're going to get bills, not for tens of thousands, but hundreds of thousands of dollars. How are they going to manage?
Well, Joe, you're right. This is a problem in healthcare. There's a trend that took hold in healthcare over the last 5 to 10 years, and it's not a good trend. Basically, stakeholders in healthcare figured out if you move things off a master hospital bill and bill separately, make them out of network, you're going to be able to gouge health plans and sometimes individuals and get more money. And so that became the game. It was off to the races. You saw things coming off the master hospital bill. You saw laboratory services, radiologic and imaging services, private doctor groups billing separately, air ambulance transport. And now all of a sudden, people are getting pounded with these surprise bills with no notification ahead of time. Even though 60% of medical care is shoppable, people walk in to a community hospital with good intentions. They rely on that great public trust that our ancestors passed on to us. And then the hospital turns around and engages in price gouging and predatory billing, which is what we call these practices. And we call them out. We uncovered the practice of hospitals suing patients. I've gone around the country telling anyone that if you've been sued by a hospital for a bill you can't afford, I will defend you in court for free. And we go around, me and the young millennials, and we go to courthouse to courthouse, and we defend these cases. We argue in front of the judges, and we win 100% of the time. And we shut down the practice. We go to the hospital donors if we need to. We start civilly, and we go to the CEOs and tell them, please stop suing patients altogether. We found a third of hospitals in the U.S. sue patients when they can't afford their bill to garnish their paychecks. I mean, we published it in JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association. Walmart workers, postal workers, food service workers. These are insured people. They've done nothing wrong. They have a job. And then the community hospital that pays no taxes goes after and sues them to garnish their wages over a surprise bill. I mean, this has gone too far. And billing quality is medical quality. Financial toxicity is a medical complication. And when we measure hospitals, we need to measure their billing quality. And so we've proposed to the ratings agencies out there, when somebody Googles the name of a hospital, don't just put the name of the hospital and the address. Put the name and the address and their average price markup and their billing quality score, including whether or not they sue patients to garnish paychecks. That'll create accountability and, to be honest, reward the many good behaving hospitals on the market today.
Dr. McCary, you have used a restaurant metaphor, the menu and the employer regarding prices before the wait person takes your order. Could you explain that, please?
Yeah, I mean, imagine you go to a restaurant and you're interested in seeing the menu, maybe to look at the prices, and you ask, can I see the menu? And they say, well, who's your employer? Oh, based on that, we're going to give you this menu that could be 10 times higher than the next table. And by the way, you can't see the other menus and you can't actually see the prices until after you're done with your meal. I mean, imagine that. I mean, the absurdity, right? This is the fundamental problem in healthcare with cost today. Okay, if inappropriate care is the driver of the next pandemic and our overuse problem, which is half of the problem I talk about in the book, the other problem is this flying blind, right? The fundamental problem in healthcare is that we have non-competitive markets. And when you see that as a consumer or policymaker, your temptation is to create rules of good behavior. Well, guess what? The fundamental problem is it's a non-competitive market. That's going to feed price gouging and gaming of the system. We need to convert that to a competitive market. And that's what we're seeing. I'm involved in Sesame Care. There's websites now. We got the price transparency executive order signed, bipartisan, went into effect this past January. It's going to move markets. Stuff is happening right now. But imagine you go to buy a ticket on an airline travel site and there's no prices. And the airline said, oh, we have to charge you after the flight. We just don't know if there's going to be turbulence and the pilot may have to bill and code more RVUs. And, it'd be absurd. You get a surprise bill for a Coca-Cola. It'd be absurd, right? It would feed price gouging. And you can set rules to say you can't overcharge someone for a surprise bill for a Coke on a plane. Or you can create competitive markets. And when we had nutrition labels promoted in public health, we took it to the policymakers as a public health community, and guess what the food industry said? You can't do this. Prices are going to surge. Food prices are going to go high. We'll have massive hunger in the U.S. It'll worsen the hunger crisis. We'll lose jobs. We'll have to fire people. It's horrible for the economy. It'll be the downfall of Western civilization if you put nutrition labels on food. None of it happened. Okay, none of that happened. Instead, we created a competitive marketplace around ingredients, and we let the market work. And that's what we are starting to do now in healthcare. And we're seeing leaders in that market.
You're listening to Dr. Marty McCary, author of The Price We Pay, What Broke American Healthcare and How to Fix It. He's a surgical oncologist and a professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. McCary has published over 250 scientific articles on the redesign of healthcare. He's been elected to the National Academy of Medicine and is editor-in-chief of MedPage Today.
After the break, just what is a billing quality score?
What's the ratio of doctors to employees in the billing department of an average hospital?
What are pharmacy benefit managers, and how do they fit into the picture on drug prices?
Are there practical ways to lower the costs of prescription drugs?
Do prescription ads on television drive you crazy?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Cocoa Via Memory Plus, a supplement with 750 milligrams of cocoa flavonols, the plant-based nutrients from fresh cocoa that help support memory. More information at cocovia.com.
We're talking today about pandemics, the sorry state of the American healthcare system, and the high cost of prescription drugs.
Dr. Marty Makary is a leading voice for transparency in healthcare. He's the recipient of the 2020 Business Book of the Year Award for The Price We Pay: What Broke American Healthcare and How to Fix It. He is a surgical oncologist and a professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Makary has been elected to the National Academy of Medicine and is editor-in-chief of MedPage Today. His current research focuses on the underlying causes of disease, vulnerable populations, and relationship-based medicine.
Dr. Makary, you've just described a situation in which a person contemplating a surgery, maybe a knee replacement surgery, something that's not done on an emergency basis, they want to know where's the best place in their community to have this done. And they go to the hospital's website and they see there a billing quality score. Well, I've never seen a billing quality score. Where does this come from and how is it calculated?
So it's in its early stages. So we've argued within the medical community that we need to measure billing quality just like we measure medical quality. You know, we use quality measures to improve healthcare, right? It creates transparency and accountability. And with that benchmarking, institutions can improve, right? And we've seen infection rates and other things improve, readmission rates improve as they have become benchmarked. Well, we need to do the same with billing quality. So last year, a colleague, Simon Matthews, and I at Johns Hopkins wrote for the Journal of the American Medical Association a standardized set of billing quality measures for healthcare, looking at whether or not institutions would give a price when people ask. I mean, a pretty simple thing, right? Somebody wants to deliver a baby. You know, they've been, for 50 years, healthcare has been giving people the runaround, right? Oh, it depends, and your insurance, and we don't know. And you know what? Airlines would never say that. They'd say, oh, it depends if the plane crashes, that would change the price of the ticket. No, you build that risk into the price of a service, and you offer a standardized price. So if somebody says, look, I want to deliver a baby, assuming things go smooth and it's a non-C-section vaginal delivery, what is the price of that bundle? And so we're seeing things move to bundles. And I think places that put out honest prices should be rewarded in the marketplace. If a hospital sues patients, we should have public accountability. Ever since we exposed the practice in an article in 2019 in JAMA, and later a topic I write about in the book, The Price We Pay, hospitals have stopped suing patients. Over half of them have stopped because we've created public accountability. This is our country working. This is our democracy. These are markets that are moving when people are educated. And that's why I love you guys, Terry and Joe. You're educating people out there about healthcare.
Dr. Makary, you cite a statistic that just blew my mind. So I'll ask you the question, how many people are in billing versus how many doctors are in practice in a quote-unquote typical hospital?
Well, we've actually seen in some hospitals, if you collectively add together administration, billing, and fundraising, it can equal the number of beds in a hospital. And so I mentioned that in the book Unaccountable, that I think it was Duke University had an equal number of administrators and billing people as they did beds in the hospital. Now, there's more clinicians. Hospitals are the largest employers in most areas. But it's amazing, this giant middle industry. And the question is, to be honest with you, do we need it, right? A lot of people are getting rich in healthcare. A lot of people, except for one. Matter of fact, everyone's getting rich except the patient, right? The everyday American consumer. And they're paying for these premiums that go up year to year through their employer. It's kind of like hidden. People think, oh, my employer is paying for it. Guess what? You're paying for it because that's coming out of the pool of money of wages and benefits. And these products are less and less transparent. The PBMs, or the pharmacy benefit managers that employers use, are this black box. And I encourage employers, if somebody has a business out there, you can save 10 to 30% on your healthcare spend if you just make the purchasing decisions better without cutting corners on the benefits. And I outline how to do so in the book, The Price We Pay, but it's an uphill battle.
Okay, Dr. McCary, you said the magic words because we've been concerned about this thing called PBMs, Pharmacy Benefits Managers. What are they? Why is it so mysterious and opaque? And how can we lower the cost of our prescription medicines? I am sure you know that there are now life-saving drugs for rare conditions, cancer, other kinds of conditions like MS, where the costs can be over $100,000 a year.
Yeah, so a PBM is a middleman in healthcare. They came along to tell employers, hey, we're going to manage all the pharmacy coverage of your employees. We're going to tell them what pharmacies they can go to. We're going to give them a pharmacy card, and we're going to contact them if we think we can get them into a less expensive equivalent medication. And so they came along. We're the only country that has PBMs, by the way. They came along with this promise to employers to be this independent fiduciary to help manage pharmacy costs in a way that is friendly and provides service to individual employees. Well, they started doing that, and what happened was the greed moved in and mass consolidation moved in. And then these companies that so-called manage the pharmacy benefits were pulling fast tricks like having markups, what we call spread pricing. And they would create a new medication like Duexis, which is a bogus medication. It's like a heartburn medication and a basic anti-inflammatory combined, and they can charge $300 or $400 because nobody has ever heard of Duexis. I mean, most people I know have not heard of Duexis, and I see employers all the time. Hey, I think I have a good pharmacy benefit manager right now. And I tell them, oh, yeah, see if you have Duexis on your formulary. 300, that's a bogus. So this is an example of spread pricing.
And theoretically, both of the components of this drug might be available like very inexpensively, possibly over the counter, right?
A couple bucks, yeah. Couple bucks. So they're charging $300. So we see this spread pricing. And in the book, The Price We Pay, I got an internal document from one of the PBMs and published it showing the spread on how much they take, sort of off the top. They're skimming money out of the system. And we got Secretary Alex Azar really interested in this topic. And of course, he came out with a PBM rule and tried to buckle down on this. But the special interests are powerful. And what happened with the PBMs over the years is that the giant insurance companies bought them. And the pharmacies started their own PBMs. So now, instead of having this independent fiduciary PBM that's trying to lower your costs as an employer, they profit from the more drugs you're on. Well, CVS Caremark is a PBM. Express Scripts, there's 3 of them that have 85% market share. And so actually they lost that fiduciary role. And employers have no idea what's going on. I talk to employers in the book and they come back and say, look, we get a printout of 500 medications our employees take. I don't know the names and the doses and frequencies and what the benchmark price is. They're given some shiny objects like, hey, we got you a 25% rebate on all your spend. Well, all of that is just a facade of a shell game that is played in order to keep the business. And so employers can generally save a lot of money by getting a good PBM strategist to help advise them on how to get a better deal. And there's a lot of them out there, and I've pointed a lot of people to good places. And we have some of that information on our website, restoringmedicine.org, where people can go and find some good partners.
Dr. McCary, I want to ask you a different sort of question, but it still has to do with the price of prescription medicines. And that is something that drives us crazy. If we watch TV, and I try to watch as little as possible, but if we watch TV, we see ads for pricey drugs. For drugs for cancer, drugs for multiple sclerosis, drugs for rheumatoid arthritis, drugs for psoriatic arthritis. Most of these are not common conditions. Most of these drugs have to be prescribed by a specialist. So why the heck are they being advertised on television?
Well, if you can get, one person to buy Humira, that could be a $60,000 or $80,000 a year infusion. And so there's big money. And in fact, PBM sometimes, it's kind of like Walmart will underprice the milk. So you come in there and buy other stuff, they'll do the same on their PBM formularies. They might offer a super competitive below market price on something and then insist that you use their vendor for the infusion services. That is the $60,000 or $80,000 drug that probably is about $5,000 in the real world, but that is the spread. And so this is a game. Now you see pharma companies marketing on these commercials, and aren't they hilarious? These commercials, man, people are so happy in these commercials, man. It's like if I take this pill, I could be this happy. They're like playing the drums in a garden with their friends and dance. They're always dancing. And it's like, what is this?
And don't forget the dogs.
And there's always dogs and kids, and you're jumping in the sky with a rainbow in the background. And it's like, okay, I give in. I'll just take it. I don't know what it's for, but I'll just take it, right? And the reality is that these are very lucrative through infusion services. Now, the market size is small, but the margins are high. We encourage the government, both Nancy Pelosi's office and the last presidential administration through Secretary Azar, bipartisan, to require drug companies to put the real price on the ads. Now, they liked it, and they actually made an announcement. If you remember, HHS made an announcement. The pharma companies went berserk. They went bananas and said, look, here's our counter proposal. We instead will create a website where the prices will be listed. Well, they fought and they fought and they fought, and they won. They're very powerful lobbyists. They won. They squashed the idea. At the end, we said, oh, by the way, you won the fight. Where's that website that you were promoting? And they pointed us to this website that was so clunky. You had to enter so much personal information. I spent 30 minutes on it trying to find the price of a drug. Never got to the price. They wanted all my personal health and personal information. It was a joke, right? This was a joke. And so I think people, I believe in transparency. I think it moves markets.
Dr. McCary, you talk a lot in your book about overtreatment. And I think, watching those commercials makes a lot of people want to, have the rainbow and the dog and the happy kids and the big smiles. And so they think, yeah, medicines. But there are also guidelines from a lot of specialty areas in medicine, whether it's blood pressure or cholesterol or you name it. And I'm just wondering the impact of the pharmaceutical industry on some of those guidelines and recommendations. And then I'd like you to tell us what patients can do about it, whether it's transparency, access to medical records, et cetera.
Well, it's amazing. We asked doctors in a national survey on overtreatment, 2,000 doctors around the United States, how common is the problem of overtreatment? The average answer was 21% of all medical care is unnecessary. That's in the opinion of practicing physicians. And they broke it down. It was like 24% of all medications administered. Now, when you have people prescribing, telling you that 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 things done in that industry is entirely unnecessary, that should be a wake-up call. And I think people right now don't have a lot of options. You can educate yourself, and I've tried to encourage that. You can get a second opinion. You can also just ask your doctor, look, I don't like to take medications unless there's a clear benefit. Are there other alternatives? Can we talk about food as medicine, lifestyle changes, exercise, things I'm eating? If somebody walks in overweight, massively overweight, into a doctor's office, chances are you will hear 5 different diametrically opposed philosophies on how to lose weight. The reality is that not everybody is up on the latest data. It turns out that saturated fat is not directly associated with heart disease. Heart disease is an inflammatory condition, and certain foods are increase your body's general inflammation. We've not been talking about inflammation. 10, 20, or 50 years from now, at some point, when we talk about your health, we're going to be talking about how inflamed your body is. Inflammation drives arthritis, heart disease, contributes to cancer, involved in Alzheimer's. It's all related to glucose metabolism. We're the first generation in the history of the world that has been raised addicted to refined added sugar and raised on processed food together. So this is a social experiment. And right now, the health outcomes show it, right? We have a food system that was designed for health insecurity, not for health. And now we've got to reverse that.
Dr. McCary, you wrote a book called Unaccountable, What Hospitals Won't Tell You. And I'm just wondering what's happened since that book, especially when it comes to things like mistakes. Have we become more transparent?
Yeah, I think that everything I wrote about in that book has come true. We now have publicly reported measures of quality, things like infection and readmission rates. We have those things driving improvement. We have benchmarking. We have second opinions now that are extremely common because people recognize the value of getting another opinion. We've got virtual second opinions. So there's a lot of stuff that I basically called for in the book Unaccountable that has come true. As a matter of fact, almost everything has played out. But there's a lot of room to go. We still have a lot of errors in care that are not the traditional medical mistakes of somebody accidentally stab somebody with a scalpel, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people falling through the cracks. We're talking about complications that are normal and expected of things that should have never happened, right? So somebody is on a medication they should not have been on. And in the book, The Price We Pay, I tried to be very honest. Like, I feel horrible. I feel terrible, Joe and Terry, that I prescribed opioids for years to people who should have never been on them or should have been on a much lower dose. And with good intentions and maybe bad teaching and bad science, I did what I thought was in the best interest of people. And I was not that attuned to the addiction risk and all these things that we've since learned about. And I had an aha moment at a certain point. But you look back and that is a form of medical error. Prescribing an opioid to somebody who should not have been on an opioid. Right? Those are some of the many forms of variations in the quality of care that we have not been talking about that we need to be talking about. And so I was proud to usher in some of that conversation with the book Unaccountable, which of course now is the TV show The Resident, which is a little bit sensationalized for Hollywood and a little fun and a little true. And so it's good to see that conversation take place along with the many other voices like Don Berwick who have been talking about this for years.
Dr. McCary, another form of medical error, perhaps, that you have talked about is screening. Screening when people don't actually need to be screened. Tell us about that problem.
Yeah, again, we're living in an era of the medicalization of ordinary life. Now, it's important to get screening for colon cancer when you turn 50 or have some risk factors to start even sooner. But in general, if you look at the pattern in all of the medical literature, there's a trend that we are recommending as the data come in and as we learn to do less. Doctors have been doing too much, again, with good intentions. But if you look at, whether or not somebody needs a radical breast operation versus a lumpectomy, if somebody needs a colon removal for diverticulitis or a minimally invasive intervention or just antibiotics and watch and wait. These are new management strategies that are revealing a broader trend in the entire world of medicine that on average, we are learning that we were doing too much. And screening is one of those areas, right? We've seen people undergo screening and then have normal findings present to us as doctors. Nobody knows what to do with them because they look a little funny. but there's no cancer or anything. And some people end up undergoing surgery or more testing because of it. For example, there's a guideline now that says you shouldn't really have screening for your circulation in your blood vessels in your extremities if you don't have any problems. If you don't have any problems, what are we looking for? We're going to find a plaque and then we're going to subject you to an angiogram and then subject you to surgery. I mean, this is something that takes place and it's rampant, as I describe in the book, The Price We Pay. This is almost an assembly line of medicalizing ordinary life. And people go to these surgery centers after they get screened at a church, say, at a health fair, saying, we look, your circulation may not be good in your legs. Let's do a formal X-ray angiogram. They do that under fluoroscopy. The circulation may look a little funny. There might be a blockage there. They have some stent put in their leg artery. If you looked at everybody over age 75, you could probably find some atheroma or plaque in at least 90% of people in their leg arteries. Doesn't mean we have to open it up. And by the way, if we open it up, sometimes the lining of the metal stent can promote more blockages. And so these are things where it's not as simple as we first thought. Again, there's no general rules. We have two problems in medicine: undertreatment and overtreatment. Both kill people. But by far, the overtreatment problem right now is dominating healthcare, driven by our fee-for-service system. By the way, when COVID came, remember the fee-for-service system, which is kind of like an addiction, as my friend Chris Chen likes to point out. It's like any addiction, like drugs or gambling. These fee-for-service hospitals were just on this gravy train of this stream of revenue, of cash on a fee-for-service mill. And what happened is COVID just sort of stopped people. People said, hold off. I'm going to hold off on going to the hospital for, semi-urgent or non-urgent things. And these hospitals all of a sudden were starving like an addict, right? And when you're addicted to something like gambling, the solution is more gambling. And so they immediately rushed Capitol Hill, banging on the doors, demanding, just give us money, right? We're already these wealthy healthcare institutions, with some exceptions in rural areas. Just give us cash, right? And it was this addiction. And on the flip side, you saw the value-based clinics, the subscription-based clinics, the IORAs, the Chen Meds, the Medicare Advantage plans. They were humming along just fine, financially stable, taking care of their patients without the drama of this fee-for-service addiction.
Dr. McCary, you wrote an article in BMJ with colleagues about medical errors, and you suggested that medical errors were the third leading cause of death in America. Wow. Did you get pushback from your colleagues? Can you tell us a little bit about the fallout from that article and where we are today?
Yeah, it's interesting. It was really a review article that described the published literature on the topic, and it summarized the other studies. And yet that was sort of offensive enough to the old guard medical establishment that they launched a backlash to say that this was a flawed study. Well, it wasn't a study. We didn't study anything. All we did was summarize the literature. And so this irrational territorial debate ensued. And ironically, as people were saying, it's not the third or fourth leading cause of death, which the estimates place it in that ballpark. Even if, by the way, if you use the old Institute of Medicine study, up to 100,000 lives deaths may be attributable to error. That puts it at number 4. And so we're basically saying in the article, like, this is a public health problem. Okay, this is not a one-off. There's gag orders that sort of silence any circumstances around things that go wrong. By the way, let's not blame the doctors. Let's look at the system problems. And if you believe the old numbers that are cited and sort of canonized, that puts the problem at the 4th leading cause of death. So we try to just contextualize the burden of this as it affects everyday people. And so there was this sort of irrational, shouting, kind of an early predecessor of what we now have with Twitter, where just the vitriol and the anger and the territorialism. Ironically, about a year after the article came out, it turns out that medical error was clearly the number one cause of death among people under age 50 in the United States in the opioid epidemic. That is, the vast majority of people who died from opioids, which was the number one cause of death in people under 50, should not have been on opioids. I'm very honest about my participation in that problem, along with everyone I know. And that's the irony, right? It is not just tripping over a power cord of a ventilator in an ICU. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about medical errors. We're talking about people falling through the cracks, people being prescribed things they shouldn't be prescribed, even if it's with good intentions. These are the subtle forms of medical error that we described with a broadened definition of medical error that I believe was more patient-centered. Do I think medical error is the third leading cause of death? Maybe the fourth leading cause of death. If we look at the published literature, it's somewhere in that ballpark. And the problem is we don't measure it because there's no ICD-9 code for it. There's no billing code for deaths that are attributable to, say, an opioid overdose that allow us to ascribe it as an error.
Dr. Marty Makary, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Great to be with you, Terry and Joe. Really love your show.
You've been listening to Dr. Marty Makary. He's a surgical oncologist and a leading voice for transparency in healthcare. Dr. Makary received the 2020 Business Book of the Year Award for The Price We Pay, What Broke American Healthcare and How to Fix It. As a professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, he's been elected to the National Academy of Medicine and is editor-in-chief of MedPage Today. His current research focuses on the underlying causes of disease, vulnerable populations, and relationship-based medicine.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
The People's Pharmacy is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
To buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy episode, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1250. The number again, 800-732-2334, on the web at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit the website, you can share your thoughts about today's show. Have you had an antibiotic-resistant infection? They're becoming increasingly common, and they can be very frightening. We're also interested in your thoughts about prescription drug advertising on television. Do you think they help inform you, or are they more confusing than helpful?
You can subscribe to our podcast through your favorite podcast provider. We post the show on our website on Monday morning. You might also want to share it with a friend.
The podcast for this week will include our discussion with Dr. Makary about his book, Unaccountable, on Medical Errors. Has transparency increased since he published it? How did his colleagues react when he wrote in the BMJ that medical errors are the third leading cause of death in the U.S.? We'll also discuss screening. Is there such a thing as too much testing? You'll find it under the podcast tab at peoplespharmacy.com.
At our website, you can sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about COVID-19 and other important health stories. By subscribing to our newsletter, you will also have regular access to our weekly podcast. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week.